So the next stage in the casement window build is to start on the actual casements themselves, so the opening part of the window. Now we're going to take a measurement off the frame. We can use a drawing to get the measurements too, because it's all nice and accurate, but we're measuring between the rebates on the outside. So in this case we've got 5, 6, 7. I'm going to take that as a tight measurement, so 5, 6, 7 is our width. And our height, like I told you from the rods drawing, is from the back of the rebate on the sill, so the highest point to that rebate in the top of the frame. So 9, 5, 7. Whenever you're measuring anything for joinery, the proper method is to do width first, then height. You'll see a lot of supplier companies do the height first in their measurements, and it's wrong. Okay, so if we go back to the rods drawing we did of the height of the window a bit earlier on in the build, you can see at this point how it corresponds to the actual window itself. So we've just drawn them cross sections in of the head and of the sill here, and that's exactly how it is on the actual window itself. Okay, so the casements for this window are just a plain style casement. So we've got a top rail, a bottom rail, and then 2 stiles to make the casement up. So we've got our measurement there of 5, 6, 7 in the width and 9, 5, 7 in the height. So the height of the casement, 957, we need to add about at least 20mm to that for our cutting list. So if we say 980 for the stiles in the cutting list, and then on the rails we're going to add again 20mm to that measurement, because the tenons go right through to the outside edges of the casement. So 570, 580. So we're at 585, 590. If we're tight on a piece of wood to cut multiple lengths out and there's sort of 10mm in it, we'll just go back and check how tight these measurements are and whether we could get away with cutting it just that bit shorter and getting that extra piece out the length of wood. But there are cutting list lengths. The actual timber size for the casement is going to be 58 by 58mm for the stiles and the top rails. So at 58 by 58 we're going to need, for this specific window, 2 stiles per casement, so there's 2 casements, so we're going to need 4 lengths of timber at that. And at 590, so the width that's making up the rails, at 58 by 58 there's just 1 piece per casement, so that's 2 lengths at that size. And then for the bottom rails we're going to be finishing with a 58 by 95mm bottom rail. So again we're going to take the width measurement, 590, the pencil's broken here, 590, and we're going to want 2 of them because there's 2 casements in the window. So that's our basic cutting list for the casements on this window, and we'll go back to our timber that we were left with after cutting from the frame and work out the best way of cutting this out. Okay, so these 2 pieces are the offcuts from the frame. So this was a 2.6 metre length and a 1540. So you're basically going to get 1 stile out of that and then a pattern piece. So we'll rip that down first to the width of the stiles. So we'll rip that down to about 65mm, as long as it's pretty straight. If it's got a curve or a bend in it, we'll either plane that flat first and then go to 65, or just widen up the rip saw a little so we've got some allowance for planing that up straight. So that one down to 65, that'll give us 1 stile and a pattern piece, and the offcut will make a nice piece to do some beading with. Next piece here is 2.6. by 100mm, so got a nice thickness on that. We'll cut one length off at 600, so that will make a bottom rail. So we're making the most of that 100mm width to use it as a bottom rail. And then I'll get 2 stiles perhaps out of the rest of it. Actually, because that piece is a nice width where we might get 2 stiles out of there. If we do another 600 out of this piece, that'll give us both of our bottom rails. So that'll be 1200 in total. Then we just want 1 stile out the rest of this piece of wood. And then if we just cut this one off at the length of the stile, so it's around 1 metre, 980, that'll give us our last 2 stiles, and then 1 more cut at 600 will give us 2 top rails. Be really careful on the crosscut if you're cross-cutting non-straight and square timber. If there's a slight bow in the timber as you cut it, it's going to pinch on the blade as you release that tension in the timber, and it's going to cause the saw head to fly towards you, and it's really quite violent and quick when it happens. There's no chance of you getting out of the way of it, so keep your hands well out of the way. There's a lot more confidence in a saw like this than a lightweight saw like a DeWalt radial arm saw. So if you see me cutting through something quite confidently, like a big piece of oak, just be wary if you've not got a really big heavy saw to cut that there is a chance that the saw blade can bite into the wood and propel itself at you. So there we go, we've got 4 stiles, so 4 uprights, 2 bottom rails, 2 top rails, and I've got plenty of pattern pieces, so you're going to want to get a fair few of these pattern pieces, the same styles, same size stock as the stiles here, but just short lengths that you can use to set up the machinery and make test cuts, etc. Especially for when you're doing the joint, it's quite difficult to get that perfect fit. Okay, so we're planing these bits up. Remember, it's whichever side has a C-shaped curve in it, we're going to put the ends down to the bed so that the end's planed first. Keep the beds lubricated, and we want perfectly straight, perfectly square timber out the end of it. And we're just planing one face and one edge on the surface planer. And onto the thicknessing, I've ripped everything down to 65mm and then planed, so I know I'll fit anything up to 60mm through the thicknesser. So I'm going to set it to 60mm and then work my way down to 58mm from there. Again, just like the frames, when we got to that nominal thickness of 60mm or whatever it is near to our finished thickness, we're going to take a small amount off each surface to get that really clean, planed finish. Okay, so casements are actually fairly simple compared to frames. It is just a joint and it's glued together. There's not too much going on in regards to draft strips and all sorts of different grooves and setups. So it's a fair bit quicker in the process. So we're going to use in this video and technique the same methods for creating the mortise and tenon on the saw, circular saw or bandsaw, whichever you've got. But I think it's going to be easiest if we just set out a rod first for the casements, so you've got something to reference to as you build them, and it's going to make sense. It's going to make a little bit more sense along how to construct the joints. So we'll just set the combi square up here to the thickness of the timber, which is 58mm, and run a line the length of this board. So this is a full size rod applicable for the current window that we're making. So we've got a height of our casement that we've measured from the frame of 957. So we'll just tick that off. And we can square that line over. You can of course draw this rod within the actual frame rod, so you could draw the whole cross section out like I've done on the computer, and actually draw the casement within these sections here and have it all on the same drawing. But I find it's easier and less complicated just to have a separate rod for this specific part that you're making, unless you need to reference it against other parts. So we've got a top rail in this casement, the same thickness, same width as the thickness, so 58mm. So we'll go from that overall measurement in 58mm, and we'll square that line across. And again at the bottom of the casement we've got a 95mm bottom rail. So we're going to come in from the end of the casement 95mm and mark that line there. Now from them lines we've just put on, we're going to use a 15mm glazing rebate, and because the mortise is again in the rebate and we're going to machine that material away, we need to use a setback of 15mm. So we'll draw that line on again, nice and light. So that is the material that's left to form our tenon, from the end of the board there to that setback line. And we're going to use a wedged mortise and tenon, so we need some material behind the tenon here that we can wedge against. So we've got 80mm left. Most people say to split that in half, so 40mm, but I prefer to just come a bit higher than that, so I'd go between 30 and 35mm. I'd say on this job probably go to 30mm. It just gives you a bit of room to plane a bit off the casement and have wedge room in there, and still have an equal amount left of timber behind that wedge. If you go halfway at 40mm and then you've got say 7mm of wedge being hammered in there against this material that's left, and then you have to plane say 5mm off the casement in the fitting process, you're not left with an awful lot of timber behind that wedge, and I have seen them bits of timber actually break out the end of the stile. So I'd just go top side of halfway, so let's go 30mm on this specific joint. And we'll put a line in there. Back to the top rail, so the same thing on the top rail. We've got a 15mm setback. And then in terms of material that's left on the top rail, we're not going to get much more of a tenon than the thickness of the chisel, so we're using a 16mm mortise, so we're going to have a 16mm square tenon. Okay, so there are set out lines for the through tenons within the door stiles. Now if you want to see what that looks like as a cross section, we can draw that on. So from the outside of the sash to the inner edge where the glazing sits up against, if we go back to our drawing, we're left with a 15mm seat on that piece of timber to form the rebate. So it's a 43mm glazing rebate. So from that outer line, we want 43mm. It should leave 15mm on the inside, and we can run that line in on our rod now. We're effectively just drawing this section out here. That'll be the tenon line as well, so we're putting the tenon in that position. So we can mark the tenon on as per the drawing at 16mm, and that'll be our tenon position there. So the cross on the timber is where the tenon will go through. So we've got a square rebate here. Mark it on as timber. 43 by 15mm rebate in that bottom rail, and then a tenon there of 30mm depth by 16. You can do the same on the top here. Run that line through enough. That's our tenon there with the cross. We're going to rebate this section away of timber, and we're left with a piece of timber outlined here by the grain. And that's our top rail shape. So from this setting out rod, you can either do one of these for every casement, so you sort of got a picture in your head of what you're doing in size wise. But with this style of casement, because you've not got lots of little dividing glazing bars in between, it's fairly easy just to mark your overall width and then these specific points where we need to mortise on the rails themselves. Right, so we've got our 4 stiles here. So again, I'm going to look for any imperfections throughout the stiles and mark them on with a pencil. So I've got a little split here. We're just going to make them a bit more visible, so when we're assessing the actual piece itself, to give it a orientation in the casement, we've got sort of the most informed decision as to where we're going to put it. There's nothing wrong with that bit of wood, but it's just got a bit of discolouring, so I'm just going to draw my eye to it, try and disguise it if we can. Same again there, that's not a split, it's just a discoloured grain. So in terms of disguising an imperfection within this casement, that's the cross section of the timber here. Our most seen face, or our most important part, is this section here. So this is the inside edge of the glazing, and then the inside face that you will see from the inside of the window. So that will be our face. That will have the squiggly face mark on it, and this will have the V-shaped edge mark on it on this this top edge here. So in terms of hiding an imperfection, if it's something that's only 15mm in depth, in the correct plane, so on the edge of the timber, the best place to get rid of it is to actually cut it out in this rebate, so we can sort of encapsulate the imperfection, and as long as it doesn't stretch beyond this point here or this point here, we can get rid of that in the rebate. Even if it's a split that starts over here and runs into the timber like this and stops in the middle, that's perfect, because you're not going to see it because of all this glazing, rebate and beading. The next place to hide it is on this back edge here, so from anywhere from here to in here. That's sort of your second best option for hiding any imperfection. So it's going to spend most of its time in a closed position, sat against the frame where no one's going to see it. So if you've got an imperfection on a corner here that runs across the whole edge, you're better off putting it on the outside of the sash and not seeing it than having it here somewhere where it's going to interrupt with this glazing rebate. So we'll go back to this piece that we've marked all the imperfections on. So we've got a bit of discoloration here and a small split here and here. So that's quite a nasty little bit really, because that split runs all the way along here. It's not actually a split, it's more of a deep grain with a discoloration, but it's not very nice to see. That is a split just there. So I don't want to put that anywhere that's going to be seen, or specifically not on the outside of the window, because a split towards the outside is really difficult to seal and keep sealed from the weather. So I think I'll try and incorporate that in the rebate if I can. Let's have a look. No, there's no real way to, if I try and rebate this section out, we've got a sort of a slight split here right on this edge. We're going to be left with this section on the most visible part of the window, which is not what I want. So I'm going to have to, with this piece, put this towards the outside, so that towards the rebate in the frame, and then have either this face or this face as my inside. So I'm going to go with this face because it's a bit nicer figure on the timber. Keep this face as my inside edge, so my rebate will be here. This is my inside, and then on that back edge where the hinges will be on the hinge style, we'll have this imperfection hopefully hidden from view. Because we've got a small split in there, I'm going to keep that away from the bottom of the window. So actually on this piece I'm going to mark a top symbol. I want that to be the top of the sash. Run through the same process for all the pieces until you've got a face and edge mark in the best possible place. With this piece here, we've not held up to size, just slightly on one end of the timber. So I would avoid using that face or the opposing face on the opposite side. So that one with the imperfection, or that one there, I'd avoid using them as the face side. So I'd keep that, I'd try and keep it, if the rest of the timber will allow, as that on the back edge there, so that when we plane the casements in to fit them to the frame, this will actually get taken out with that planing. So the best orientation, if you've got a cut like that, is it to make this side the face, and then that side the inside edge. So put that on the opposite side to the inside edge. if you're going to mark one with a top to bias it towards the top end of the casement, put it on the edge side, because when we're setting them all out, we'll align them all so that the edge side is facing up. So once you've got them face marks on, we want them V-groove or V-shaped edge marks to point to each other. So they want to be in pairs of 2. So we've got 2 casements, 4 stiles, and we've got all our V-grooves pointing to each other. So we're definitely going to end up with 2 pairs of stiles and not all the stiles in the same hand. So we've only got one that needed a definite top position. So that's going to be the top end of all of these stiles. We'll clamp them together. And we're basically going to copy what we've put on this rod drawing here. So these lines that we've drawn on this, we're going to transfer to the casements. So instead of just ticking them over, I'll reset that out so it makes sense whether you're using either method. So we want to take the height of a casement, which was 957, and even that up between the 2 ends of these stiles. So we should have at least 20mm extra length on there. I've got 1 metre and 15, so we've got about 10, 20, 60mm. So I'm going to work from 30mm at that end and then mark on 957 plus 30mm at this end. Just a quick check from the end of the tape to make sure that's right. Should negate any 100mm losses at this point. And then this is our top side, because we've defined it with this top mark. I'm just going to mark top on all of them. Doesn't really need a top mark, but it might be helpful for you to save you having to distinguish by the thinner rail. So we'll again come in 58mm for a top rail, 15mm back for that setback, and then we've got a 16mm mortise. And we just want to square all them lines over. So you should have 4 lines for your top rail and 4 lines at your bottom rail. So the first line there towards the inside of the timber is your setback. Then you've got your mortise, so that's your mortise. And this section here is the haunch, so haunch. A haunch is basically part of a mortise and tenon that isn't quite as deep as the through tenon, but will help stop the casement and the rail from twisting against each other. This section on the end is just an offcut, so that's the extra timber we've added on for use while we're planing up, and it's also nice to have a bit sticking past the end of this joint at the glue up stage. You can put a clamp on that without interfering with the wedging of these tenons. So again, the same at this end, using 100mm of the tape. Got a 95mm rail, 15mm setback brings us back to 80, then we're going to have a 30mm tenon, so that brings us back to 50. So we can square them 4 lines across them casements. Starting to lose my voice, I've never talked so much. I like to square from both sides. If you've got any slight inaccuracy in either your square or your technique for squaring a line across, it's not too drastically out. It's only across the width of 2 stiles and not all 4. So again, detailing this end of the joint, it's setback, then we've got mortise and haunch, mortise, haunch, mortise, haunch. You get the picture. And then this is offcut. Like I say, double check them outside measurements against what they need to be in the actual window frames, because this is sort of your last port of call before you stick a mortise chisel in them for checking the heights. Once we're happy with that setting out, you can label these for the windows that they're going in. If you've got numbers going on for each specific window, or whether you're calling them separate windows like bathroom window, etc., you can write that on these windows. If you're going to write that on anywhere, if you're using this style of window, do it on the face across there, because you're not going to machine anything away on the face. If you write it on the edge along here, the rebate will machine that away and lose all your markings. Now we just want to square those lines around the timber. So we've marked on the edge and we want to square the lines around the face and then back again on that next edge round from the face, so the opposite to the inside edge, because we're sending that tenon all the way through the face to that back edge. And we only want to square round the mortise line, so that line either side of the mortise, like so. Okay, so that's the mortise that we'll be putting in through the back of the stile, and then we want to put some wedges into that tenon. So in terms of a measurement, we're going to be looking around 5mm for a wedge. So we'll mark 5mm. You can do this by eye. It's sort of like it's a bit of a feel thing. You are using a wedge-shaped piece of timber. But the more accurate you can get it, the better, because if anyone sort of has a real close look at the windows and all your wedges are all exactly the same size, that's going to look really good compared to the top one being really thin and the bottom one being a double wedge because you got your joint a bit wrong. So the more accurate they can be, the better. Generally, if you want them to be absolutely perfectly the same, the wedge to the inside probably wants to be 5mm, and the wedge to that bottom edge probably or the wedge room wants to be about 4mm. That's for the case of when you cut in the haunch on the tenon to allow it into there to the mortise. So we're cutting this section away on the tenon profile. You want a tiny bit of wiggle room on that tenon to freely get it in and out, and that will be where that extra clearance comes from for your wedge, so that they end up the same size. So the same at the top, just square that mortise section round. Don't get carried away and square the set background, because it looks very similar, 16 and 15mm, and it will be 15mm too short. And the fact you'll notice that just after you've mortised it, you'll go, oh, them lines are a bit tight for the mortise chisel. Just after you've plunged it in, and then you get that overwhelming feeling of pain that you've just up. So 2 wedge room marks, again the outside one slightly smaller than the inside one. Don't run them right to the edges. Don't really know why, you can do, but it was always taught in traditional joinery that it's just a tick like that, not full width across the setting out, just a short tick across the timber, and that defines a wedge room. So do that for all 4 stiles, or however many stiles you've got to do. Okay, once we've set out our stiles, we're going to look to our rails next to set them out. I don't specifically set out the joints on every rail. I'll do it on the test pieces and then just set the machine up and cut all the rails to suit that setting. So we'll cut our rails off to width of the full width of the sash, so or the casement. So we'll go to the crosscut saw. Once we set up perfectly square again, I'm going to square one end and then flip it over and cut it to an exact length so they're all exactly the same. Okay, so I've cut the rail width off to the full width of that rebate in the frame, so the overall width measurement. I've not allowed anything for a fitting gap because that will give us some tolerance to plane some material away on fitting if we damage anything with the wedging process, or if it's slightly out of square or something like that. You're going to give yourself a bit of tolerance to square the casements up, etc. So if you're really confident that you're going to do a perfect joint and get everything right, you could probably knock 4 mil off in each direction for a start with, and then you've only got to remove a tiny amount of timber to square it up and get the fit right within the frame. So it's your choice really what cut width you do that measurement and what height you set the sashes out, but we're going to work on this process of working from a point where everything's tight for a start when we come to fit the frames. I've also squared up at the same time all the ends on all of my pattern pieces, so we're just going to use one of these to set the tenon joint out on for the rails. So we want a measurement from the end of the timber, basically the thickness of that stile timber, so it's 58 mil. Now we can use a piece of actual stile that we finished the same as to just flush up on the end of that piece of timber and check that that line is pretty accurate. Want to just square that over, and then we want to add in a setback of 15 mil. Now that setback, because this is the tenon section, it's going to have the shoulders that engage into the stiles, because we've rebated the stile, so we've cut into it. One of these shoulders has got to be longer or deeper into that stile to engage into that cut. So that's our 15 mil. So I ought to put a face mark on this for a start, so our face would be here, and we're working on our edge. Again, we can use a mortise gauge or just a pencil line to set these lines out, or a combination square, but we want that tenon to run in at that 15 mil position. So if we mark a 15 mil line on for a point for the gauge to set up from. If you stab the pins in, it will give you a point, and you can use the 100 mil of a tape from the edge to just check that position and make any adjustments as necessary. And we can gauge that in along the length of that timber. I'll just run a pencil line in there so you can see it more clearly. So that's effectively the joint we're going to cut into all of the rails. So we're going to machine this section away and this section here. Much the same as the joint in the frame. But with a casement, it's quite critical that all of these joints are perfectly square and quite tight fitting, because it's only a small joint holding quite a lot of strength together within a casement. Right, so we're back on the saw to cut these tenons. Again, we want to align the blade, so rise the blade right up and align it perfectly with this clamped tool fence. then we can set the blade height to the outside joint here, so it runs in line or just below the height of that shoulder there. So the top tooth just wants to be just below that shoulder joint, and then we can set the blade without them additions on, without the extra rails. We can set it to the outside of the joint. So use the fence to keep it parallel. Get a tooth on the blade that's pointed. Try somewhere there and clamp it down. Don't know if I mentioned it before when we tenoned the last ones, but you just want a nice chunky section of wood sat behind the timber as you tenon it, that's going to be cut nice and square in both directions on that front face, and planed on the edge and the bottom, so that when you hold it against the fence and push, it's creating a nice square action through the saw, and it's going to stop that piece of timber from tipping or lifting as it goes through the cut, and support it nicely. Just check that. If you're using a fence like this, once it's clamped down, you can just move the fence to any adjustments you want, and just give it a gentle tap to make any minor adjustments to the fit of the tenon. That looks pretty good for a first attempt, so we'll see what it cuts like. We're an absolute country mile off there, so I reckon my eyes are going squiffy. But we'll make the adjustment and bring this edge of the cut in line with that gauge line, and then we're good to go. Okay, so there we go, we've edged nicely up to that inside gauge line. With the casements, it's much more essential that that saw is dead in line with the face of the timber there. So you can get a vernier caliper and check the joint top and bottom on both sides and around the end grain, and just keep tweaking the bevel on the saw until that's absolutely perfectly in line with the face of that material. Once we've got that setup done, we can run everything through, because all the joints are the same on the casement. So we're working from the face again with the circular saw there to produce the tenon. So we want to set these out with a face and edge mark, much the same as before. You can disguise stuff on the bottom and the top of the casements, and also you've got that rebate there to disguise any imperfections on a corner. Okay, so run everything through at that one setting. If you're doing a lot of rails, You can check the setting periodically back with an initial piece that you did or a test piece. But once you've got that final setting, if you've used a couple of bits of your pattern pieces to set up on, just cross cut them off again and run them all through at that exact, so they run them through at the correct setting, so that everything is the same. And then we can add those pieces of timber back to that fence and get that nice correctly thickness tenon. Okay, so I'm just going to raise the bed up again, raise the saw blade up to meet that increased depth shoulder that we've got on the inside. That's good work out, this saw. She's not the best, bless her. There we go. So you just want to be just below that line so that the cross-cut saw will take that last little bit out. Once them pieces are in place, we can again reference from the face and do that next cut and check the tenon. I know for my 16mm mortise chisel, I want a tenon thickness of about 15.7 or above. So at the very edge of this joint are about 15.54, 15.5, 15.6, 14.8. So I'm going to adjust this slightly. Don't be afraid to adjust this, even though you've used these rails. You might find a little bit of a difference in setup. So I'm going to give this a tiny tap to adjust it and get a slightly thicker tenon. You won't get a very accurate tenon thickness reading from the edges here from a circular saw, because it can tend to just have a little bit of vibration as it comes in and out the timber. You're going to get a much better idea on tenon fit and thickness by chopping these shoulders away and physically getting that caliper across the whole tenon. So I'll make a small adjustment based on the measurements I can take now, and then I'll chop them shoulders away and see what we're left with. Right, so I've had to make a couple of adjustments and a couple of goes there to get the right fit, but I've finally got a tenon that will produce a thickness of about 15.8mm. So that's perfect for my mortise chisel. The chisel itself, as a reference for you guys, across the point there where them hollow sections just start, is 15.84, so 15.9. So it's pretty much an exact fit of the chisel, or slightly less is what tenon thickness we're looking to achieve on that casement joint. Using the circular saw like in a manner like this isn't the most accurate way of producing tenons. You're going to see a bit of variation in the thickness. And of course you're holding it manually against the fence as well, so any mechanical way of holding it against the fence is going to be better. But yeah, you expect to see a tiny bit of variation. They're not going to be as perfect as if you use a tenoner or some form of tenoning jig. So once we've set that tenon, we've got the two cuts done, we can move over to the mortiser. Again, face to the fence, same principle as the frame. Put one of the tenoned pieces into the mortiser, and just adjust the position of that chisel until it's nice and in line. Both at the end of the tenon and most importantly at the shoulder of the joint, so that's where it's going to be when it's connected. That looks pretty spot on. Then we can mortise our stiles. Now the casement stiles we put into the mortiser, we're going to again reference off the face, so the face goes to the fence, and we're going to start on the back edge, so face against the fence, and we want the edge facing down. Now that's really important that you start on this edge. If you start by cutting the, I'll draw this out for you actually. So in the piece of timber, if this was our face as we looked at the piece of wood and this was our inside edge, we've got the rebate here of 15mm deep. The rail for the joint will come into it like this. So we're looking at this plane here. So the rail will sit like this with the tenon running through the timber. So we've got, in the case of the top rail, a 16mm tenon that runs through the piece of timber. I'll just guess 16mm there, but you can get the principle. So the 16mm tenon runs through the timber and is wedged either side with a timber wedge like this. You've got a 15mm setback, or 16mm tenon, sorry, and a 15mm setback which forms the rebate. So that is the inside edge of that rail. Now this rail has a haunch piece set into it. So we'll measure the full width of that, 58mm. Square that over. The haunch will go beyond that 15mm and be mortised into these stiles as well. So roughly that depth for your haunch. Now the purpose of the haunch is to stop the timber from twisting, and then on the actual tenon itself we cut this section away here and here. So from that full original section of tenon we cut that bit away, and that's what's left on the stile to wedge against with this wedge here. The reason we start mortising from the back edge first instead of in on the inside edge is because the chisel can go and be set beyond halfway to clear from both sides that halfway point. So we mortise in here, and the mortise chisel will get to roughly that position from this side, and then we can do this wedge room. And quite often, because there's not a lot of room left on this, or width left on this stile, the wedge room is going to go pretty much up to the end of that haunch room here, so that almost ends up as a point. So if we start from this side, we can nicely cut that wedge room there with this still all as full timber here that you're cutting against, so there's no breakage on this point. Same from this side, so we can cut the wedge room nicely. And then when we turn it round and we put the chisel in from this way, the chisel will cut down past halfway to this point here roughly, with the drill bit on it, like that, to here. And then we can lastly take out this haunch space here with multiple passes with the chisel, and that will just cut down to that point, and there's no pressure needed against it. You know, it's not going to cause any breakout. If you were to mortise from the inside edge first, so to do this cut first here, and then mortise out that haunch room, turn the piece over, and then mortise down here and try to cut this wedge room, because you've mortised out this section in the joint, when you mortise the wedge room, this bit of timber that's left here will just peel away. So there's nothing working against the mortise chisel here, and it'll just split. So you'll end up with nasty bits here in the joint that are not attached and just doing nothing, because they're still attached at this end, but you split all this grain out along here. So it's really important you start on the back edge of the stiles first, and then move around onto the face. I was never taught this, and I've sort of figured this out myself. I always had to just be really careful when mortising this, but then I had a realisation that if you start from the back edge, the joint supports itself and you can cut it nicely, no matter how deep that haunch room is. So we're going to need to set that haunch room up. So we need to mark a position on there that's halfway, and that's going to be the depth of our chisel, or the minimum depth the chisel needs to go on the through pass is past that point, so it clears from both sides. Now we need to mark on the rebate depth. So I'll just bring that piece of timber through for a second. So this is the inside edge where the rebate's going to go, and that's our 15mm here. Roughly, that's what the rebate will look like. So initially we want to set up our haunch room, because the way this mortiser works on the stop mechanism here, I have to set this bar first, because that's set by the locking knob, and then the other one references from it. So the end section here is the haunch. So I've got to set the haunch depth first. So that haunch depth is going to be 15mm plus whatever I want as a haunch piece. So I'm going to go 25mm on the haunch, and that will leave about 35mm left for a wedge. So if we mark a piece 25mm down, like this, it doesn't matter which side you set up on, as long as it's 25mm down on that piece of timber. And then we undo that pin, or mark the chisel at that point. We're looking for the setting to be where the flat of the mortise chisel cutter is, so like the auger bit, there's a flat part on there. That wants to be the setting there at 25mm. And that will be the base cut of our haunch. So we'll lock that off. And then when we move that lever, we need to set the through depth of the cut. So I'm going to set it to roughly there, so it's past the halfway point, so it will clear from both sides. Then I'll adjust this stop here. Tighten this up really nice and tight. I know you don't want to over tighten a little grub screw like this, but it's imperative, like it's really important that these points don't move and you keep the bed clean, so the timber is always really tight against the bed. Okay, so that's our haunch depth and through chisel depth set on the mortiser. So we can start mortising now, because we've set everything depth and width wise for the chisel. So remember, we're starting on the back edge, so where the wedge room is. We'll go mortise in on that inside face of the rail, and then we'll work our way back to the back edge and then cut the wedge room both sides. From the back edge, we're using the non-haunch setting, so we're going as deep as the machine will let us. On the wedge room, you can just make a start on these and chisel them out by hand, but I always just use sort of a bit of controlled force on the wheel as you plunge the head in, so as if it was there, a controlled force, and move the wheel at the same time as you're cutting the mortise. It takes a bit of practice to get it right without staggering it, so it's a bit of a skilled technique to get that wedge shape right, but after a while you can do it pretty quickly and pretty accurately using the machine, and I've always done them this way and never had a problem whatsoever. Remember, the inside wedge wants to be about 5mm and the outer one about 4mm. That's what it should look like within the mortise there. A nice smooth wedged channel down each side, ready for them timber wedges, and a blind mortise hole. So next we need to turn the piece of timber over, making sure we keep that face on the same edge and we don't just turn it around like this. So face to the fence. Clamp it back up, and again going in on this inside edge, so we've got a nice square surface for that joint to push up against, and then housing the rest of it out. For the mortise we're going right through again on this right through setting, and then for the haunch part out to the outside of the casement, I'm going to go on that slightly reduced depth setting. Now I would just go beyond the line there by either a chisel width or half a chisel width. Just makes it easier to clean that haunch out of them edges off the mortise chisel than if you do it tight to it. And it's the same principle on the other end. Okay, so hopefully you can see in the mortise there where we've got a nice sharp edge where that haunch there meets the wedge room on the back edge here and meets it at that point. So that's only been given by the fact that we're starting from that back edge first and then mortising this face second. It's really important to check the joint fit. So again, we can just sit the actual rail that we're going to use on there on top of the stile, and we can just cast our eye down against that joint and see how the fit's going to work. So where the actual through mortise goes right the way through, you can see the light either side of it, or if it's slightly one-sided, you can make that adjustment on the mortiser to get that perfectly flush finish joint. There we have it. That's the stiles all mortised, ready to be machined on the spindle moulder. Next we'll move on to cutting the shoulders of the tenons on the rails.